Pedro Maria was the personification of oblivion, an anonymous silhouette nestled in the filth of a Mexico City alley. Blind and abandoned, he was a ghost among the living, a man whose story had been brutally erased by the flames of cruelty. Once a skilled artisan with a gentle heart, a family man and devoted husband, his existence was reduced to tatters, to an echo of pain only he could hear. The darkness that enveloped him was not just the absence of light, but a perpetual mourning for the wife and daughter torn from him. It's a dark journey, and I know many of you connect with stories of overcoming and justice. If you believe these narratives need to be told, I ask you to subscribe to the channel. We are trying to reach the goal of 1,000 subscribers, and it would be incredible to know where you are following this story from. Comment with your city. Your support is what moves us. For Pedro, the world was not seen but felt in a chaotic and visceral symphony. The blindness imposed upon him with savage violence forced his other senses into an extraordinary evolution. He could hear the flutter of an insect's wings from meters away, feel the change in air pressure as someone approached from behind, and distinguish the smell of imminent rain from the stench of fear emanating from the darkest alleys. The city, for him, was not a map of streets and buildings, but a tapestry of sounds, smells, and textures. Every misstep, every drop of water falling from a rusty gutter, every whispered conversation painted a vivid picture in his mind, a world more detailed and dangerous than anyone with sight could imagine, turning his disability into a weapon of perception. Fragments of a sunlit past assaulted his thoughts in the rare moments of silence. He remembered the warmth of his wife's hands, the smell of freshly worked wood in his workshop, and above all, the crystal-clear laughter of his little daughter. They were memories that hurt more than any physical wound, reminders of a happiness that seemed to belong to another life, to another man. He had been Pedro, the artisan, whose fingers gave life to wood, creating little flowers and animals that delighted his daughter's eyes. Now, those same hands, calloused and dirty, gripped a crude cane, trembling not from weakness, but from a contained rage that simmered beneath the surface of his desolation, a dormant volcano waiting for the right moment to erupt and consume everything in its path. The scars on his face told only a fraction of the story. They were the map of his ruin, grotesque lines etched by fire and iron that bore witness to the night he lost everything. But the true agony resided within, an open wound that would never heal. He was a hollow man, consumed by survivor's guilt and haunted by the images of fire and the screams that echoed in his nightmares. The darkness of his eyes was a reflection of the darkness that had devoured his soul. He constantly questioned whether his revenge, the desire that kept him breathing, would bring any relief or just plunge him deeper into the abyss, turning him into the same kind of monster that destroyed his life, a fear that both paralyzed and propelled him. Mexico City in the 1990s was a character in itself, a metropolis of stark contrasts, where the opulence of the rich ignored the misery rotting at its margins. The alleys Pedro called home were fetid arteries of a corrupt system, filled with garbage, rats, and forgotten men. The air was heavy with the smell of pollution and despair, and the walls, stained by dampness and time, seemed to weep the history of countless silent tragedies. This hostile environment was the perfect mirror of his broken soul. The city didn't care about him, just as justice hadn't cared about his family. He was invisible to the world, and it was in this invisibility that he began to find his power, learning to move through the shadows as if he were a part of them. His wooden cane was an extension of his body, an instrument of survival that had become his only constant companion. To the world, it was the symbol of his vulnerability, the staff of a helpless blind man. But in his hands, it was much more. He wielded it with a precision born from years of forced practice, each tap on the ground sending vibrations that informed him of the terrain ahead. He felt the texture of the concrete, the presence of an obstacle, the proximity of a step. Secretly, he strengthened it, honed it, imagining it not just as a guide, but as a tool of retribution. The wood he once used to create life and beauty would now be the instrument of his vengeance, waiting for the moment to reveal its hidden blade. Amidst the general indifference, there was a single light. Elena, the young nun from a nearby shelter, saw beyond the scars and the filth. She saw the pain in Pedro's vacant eyes and sensed the humanity he tried to hide. Every day she brought him a portion of food and words of comfort, trying to reach the man lost in the darkness. "God has not abandoned you, Pedro," she would say with unwavering faith. But for Pedro, God had died along with his family on that night of fire. Elena's kindness was a torment, a reminder of a world of compassion to which he no longer believed he belonged, and he pushed her away with a harsh silence, fearing that her light might expose the darkness growing inside him. The calm in Pedro was a sham, a thin layer of ice over an ocean of fury. One day, sitting in his usual corner, the voice of a nearby man, bragging about a debt collected with violence, cut through the air. It was an arrogant voice, tinged with cruelty, but it was a specific detail that made Pedro's blood run both cold and hot, a particular wheezing laugh. It was the same laugh that echoed in his nightmares, the laugh of the man who held the torch. His muscles tensed, his nails dug into his palm, and his grip on his cane became so tight his knuckles turned white. The passive beggar vanished, and in his place a statue of pure rage materialized. The past wasn't dead, it was alive and laughing just a few feet away. Night fell like a shroud over the city, but for Pedro it brought clarity. That man's voice and laugh were the spark that ignited the powder keg of his soul. He did not act on impulse. Despair had taught him to be methodical. Rising with deliberate slowness, he became a shadow among shadows, following his target. His ears filtered out the noise of the metropolis, focusing solely on the specific sound of that man's footsteps, the cadence of his breath, the smell of cheap cigarettes and alcohol emanating from him. Through the night markets and labyrinthine alleys, Pedro pursued him, invisible and silent, a predator, closing in on his first prey. Every step was measured, every movement calculated, the fury consuming him channeled into a lethal concentration that sharpened his senses to a superhuman level. He knew the shortcuts and dead ends like the lines on his old, hard-working palm. He anticipated the man's path, choosing the location for the confrontation. A narrow, forgotten passage between two abandoned warehouses, a place where the darkness was so thick it seemed solid, and the only sounds were the dripping of water and the distant echo of traffic. Pedro prepared the ground with the patience of a spider weaving its web. He memorized every inch of the floor, every scattered object, every recess in the wall. He positioned himself in a dark niche, becoming part of the decrepit masonry, his breath controlled and his body motionless. His cane, once a support, now rested in his hands like a spear, awaiting the moment to strike. The city held its breath along with him. The man's footsteps echoed at the entrance of the alley, confident and careless. He hummed a tuneless melody, the sound desecrating the tense silence Pedro had established. For Pedro, every sound was an image. The scrape of boots on concrete, the jingle of keys in a pocket, the breath ragged from alcohol. He waited until the man was exactly in the center of the alley, at the darkest and most vulnerable point. The attack was an explosion of precise and silent motion. Before the victim could even process the threat emerging from the darkness, Pedro took out his legs with a swift blow and pinned him against the cold wall. The man only felt a sharp pain and the terrifying presence of an assailant he could not see, a spectre born of the night. The workshop, the fire, the names. Pedro's voice was a hoarse and icy whisper, unrecognizable, the sound of grinding gravel. Pinned against the wall, terror paralyzing his limbs, the criminal stammered, panic growing, as he realized his attacker was the blind beggar he ignored every day. Under pain and the threat of imminent death, he confessed everything, spitting out the names of his accomplices and finally, the name of the man who gave the order, Ricardo El Carnicero Vargas. With each name, Pedro's determination solidified, transforming his pain into a purpose of steel. He was no longer a victim waiting for death. From that moment, he decided he would hunt every one of them. The justice of men had abandoned him, so he would embrace the justice of the shadows, becoming the nightmare they had created. After extracting the last drop of information, the final act was quick and silent. Pedro's justice was delivered in the darkness, without ceremony. He left the body slumped on the damp ground and, before disappearing, took a small object from his pocket that he kept like a relic. It was a wooden flower, crudely carved from the memory of his fingers, the last piece he had been making for his daughter. He placed it on the dead man's chest, a macabre symbol of his motivation. It was not just an act of revenge, but a memorial. As he left the alley and blended back into the city's night, he was no longer Pedro Maria. A new being had been born in that alley, an urban legend forged in fire and loss. He was El Espectro, the blind vigilante, and his hunt had just begun. With the list of names burning in his mind like a branding iron, Pedro began his grim pilgrimage for justice. The second target, a henchman known for his brutality, frequented a noisy cantina in the heart of a working-class neighborhood. Disguised in his beggar's invisibility, Pedro spent days outside, mapping the man's routine through sounds. He learned to distinguish his heavy footsteps, the sound of his favorite chair, scraping the floor, and the tone of his drunken voice. He used the charity of others to his advantage, receiving coins, while his true purpose was to gather intelligence. Each snippet of conversation, each laugh, weaving the noose he would soon tighten around his next victim's neck, a ghost collecting data for an execution. The night of the hunt was choreographed by the cacophony of a street market. The target left the cantina, drunk and arrogant, plunging into the crowd. To anyone else, he would have been safe, but for Pedro, the chaos was an ally. He moved through the mass of people like water, the sound of the stalls, the music, and the bargaining muffling his movements. In a narrow alley used as a makeshift restroom, he cornered the man. The confrontation was a blur of muffled violence, where Pedro's cane moved with terrifying speed. The death was quick, efficient, and almost silent. And, as before, a small wooden flower was left on the man's chest, a silent seal that was beginning to tell a terrifying story to the city's criminals. The task of deciphering these deaths fell to Sergeant Morales, a man whose soul was as worn as the soles of his shoes. One of the few honest cops in a force corroded by corruption, Morales saw the world in shades of grey, but the law in black and white. When reports of a justiciero ciego reached his desk, he dismissed them as media hysteria. There were no ghosts, only men. He visited the crime scenes, ignoring the fantastic theories of his colleagues. He noted the surgical precision of the attacks, the absence of witnesses, and the most intriguing detail, the wooden flower. For Morales, this was not the mark of a spectre, but the signature of a methodical man driven by a deep and personal fury. While Morales investigated, the city buzzed with the legend of the blind avenger. The tabloid papers splashed the nickname across their headlines, turning Pedro into a mythical figure, an angel of death for some, a monster for others. In the streets, people whispered stories about him, each adding a more fantastic detail. This notoriety was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it sowed panic in the cartel's ranks, making Ricardo Vargas's men look over their shoulders and fear the shadows. On the other, the growing media and police attention put immense pressure on Pedro. Anonymity, his greatest asset, was slipping away, forcing him to act with even more caution and urgency in his solitary war. Pedro's hunt led him to the third name on the list, a cartel lieutenant who managed a smuggling warehouse in the port district. This was a more difficult target, constantly surrounded by armed guards. The infiltration required days of patient observation, memorizing patrol patterns, shift changes, and security flaws. Pedro used a sewer drain that ran beneath the warehouse, a fetid and claustrophobic path that would lead him inside the enemy fortress. The darkness and the repulsive environment, which would deter anyone else, were his natural habitat. He moved through the underground with the certainty of an animal in its den, emerging in the heart of enemy territory without anyone noticing his ghostly presence. Inside the warehouse, the air was a mixture of smells: sea salt, engine oil, and the metallic odor of weapons. The sound of water dripping from a leaky roof created a constant rhythm, a metronome for the violence that would follow. Pedro used the vast space and the stacks of crates to move undetected, a predator. In his hunting ground, he eliminated the guards one by one, using sound to lure them into the shadows before neutralizing them with brutal and silent efficiency. The lieutenant, found in his office counting money, didn't even have a chance to draw his weapon. He only felt the icy presence behind him and heard a whisper before the darkness swallowed him, leaving only silence and another wooden flower on a pile of bills. Far away, in a luxurious mansion protected by high walls and security guards, Ricardo El Carnicero Vargas received the news of another loss. Surrounded by luxury and power, the idea of a blind beggar decimating his men was an inconceivable insult. At first, he laughed, crediting the deaths to rival gangs, but the consistency, the signature of the wooden flower, began to corrode his arrogance, planting a seed of paranoia in his cruel mind. He, who built his empire on fear, now felt an unfamiliar pang of unease. The threat didn't come from a rival he could see and crush, but from a ghost, a macabre bedtime story that was becoming real and bloody. El Carnicero's paranoia quickly turned into a volatile fury. He began to see traitors in every corner, suspecting that someone from within was helping the mysterious vigilante. Mistrust poisoned the loyalty of his men. Meetings became interrogations, and failures were punished with exemplary brutality. The cartel, once a cohesive criminal machine, began to fracture under the pressure of its unstable leader. El Carnicero ordered his men to turn the city upside down in search of the ghost, promising a generous reward to whoever brought him in, dead or alive. The hunt had become mutual. The hunter was now also the most coveted prey in the city. Pedro felt the change in the streets. The presence of cartel men became more conspicuous, their gazes more watchful. He was no longer just ignored. Now, every beggar, every figure in the shadows was viewed with suspicion. One night, his instinct saved him. As he approached an alley he used as an escape route, he sensed a disturbance in the air, heard silence where there should have been noise. It was a trap. He retreated into the shadows seconds before a group of henchmen emerged, sweeping the area with flashlights and guns drawn. That near miss with death was a warning. He was getting careless, and rage was clouding his judgment. The city was becoming a cage, and he needed to be smarter than ever. Exhausted and with a superficial cut on his arm from the previous night's escape, Pedro took refuge near Elena's shelter. The soft sound of a hymn coming from the chapel drew him in. Hiding in the shadows, he heard Elena's voice, not in a formal prayer, but in a sincere conversation with her God. She asked for all the lost souls of the city, for the oppressed, for the criminals, and to Pedro's surprise, she asked for the soul of the vigilante. She prayed that he would find peace and abandon the path of blood he was treading. Her words were like needles in his conscience, a painful reminder of the man he had been and the humanity he was sacrificing with every step on his journey of revenge. Later, as he tried to clean his wound with a dirty rag, Elena found him. Her eyes showed no fear or judgment, only a deep compassion that disarmed him. Without a word, she took out a small first aid kit and began to clean the cut. The gentle touch of her hands was foreign to him, a stark contrast to the violence that defined his life. "Revenge is a poison you drink, hoping the other person will die," she said softly, her voice firm but without condemnation. She didn't need to know the details. She saw the pain that drove him and offered him a way out, a chance to stop before it was too late. Pedro jerked his arm away abruptly, Elena's touch burning like fire. He stood up, the facade of El Espectro reassembling, colder and more impenetrable than ever. Looking in the direction of her voice, with his eyes that saw nothing, he uttered the words that would create a chasm between them. "The man you want to save is already dead." His voice was a harsh rasp, devoid of emotion. "He burned along with his family in that workshop. What's left of me doesn't seek salvation, none. It only seeks a reckoning." It was both a confession and a sentence, the acceptance of his own damnation. He turned his back on her, and on the last spark of hope she represented, and plunged back into the darkness he had chosen as his only home. Meanwhile, Sergeant Morales was not idle. The wooden flower intrigued him. He took one of the pieces to an old botanist and then to a retired carpenter, who identified the wood as a specific type of jacaranda, popular among artisans in a particular neighborhood. Morales cross-referenced this information with old records and found a cold case, an arson at a craft workshop years ago. The report listed 3 deaths, a woman and her daughter, and the owner, an artisan named Pedro Maria, whose body was never found. The pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. The ghost was starting to get a name and a face, and Morales felt he was getting closer to the truth behind the vigilante's rage. The conversation with Elena, though he had disowned it, left a mark on Pedro. The nights grew longer, and the memories of his wife and daughter, which once fueled him, now haunted him with the question he dared not answer. Would they be proud of the monster he had become? Revenge, which had seemed so pure in its initial purpose, now revealed itself as a lonely and empty path. Every life he took pushed him further from the man his family had loved. He was becoming a shell, an instrument of death, driven by a pain that never subsided. Victory, he began to fear, would not bring him peace. Only the deafening silence of a fulfilled purpose and an irredeemably lost soul. In a rare moment of rest during the day, Pedro sat on a distant park bench, his anonymous presence allowing him to observe without being observed. A child's laughter caught his attention. He turned toward the sound and, through his ears, saw a father lifting his daughter into the air, the little girl squealing with joy. The scene, so simple and beautiful, was a stab to his heart. For an instant, the relentless vigilante disappeared, and in his place was just Pedro Maria, the father, feeling the phantom weight of his own daughter in his arms. The tears he thought had long dried up threatened to well. That moment of unbearable pain reaffirmed his mission, but also tinged it with the deepest of sorrows. Morales's investigation inevitably led him to Elena's shelter, a hub of information about the city's marginalized population. He hoped to find clues, maybe someone who had heard something. Upon arriving, he saw the nun talking to a blind, scarred beggar. He approached, and Elena introduced them. Morales, out of duty, began asking questions about the violence in the streets, about the so-called vigilante. He directed a question to Pedro, expecting a monosyllabic answer, but was surprised by the man's lucidity. "Sometimes," Pedro said in his hoarse voice, "when the law is blind to injustice, justice must find other eyes." The depth of that response intrigued the detective, who stared at him for a long moment. The dialogue between the two men was a game of verbal chess. Morales, the representative of the law, spoke of order and due process, of the importance of not becoming the monster you hunt. Pedro, the anonymous beggar, countered with the reality of the streets, the failure of a system that protects the powerful and abandons the weak. "Whose order, Sergeant? The order that allows wolves to devour sheep and then investigates the disappearance?" he questioned. Morales felt a chill. There was a sharp intellect and an ancient pain behind those words. He was facing an important piece of the puzzle, but he couldn't yet see the full picture. He thanked the man and left, but the blind man's voice and words would echo in his mind. For Pedro, that encounter was a deafening alarm. The sergeant was good, honest, and far too close. He knew Morales would eventually connect the dots, find his old name and his story. Time was running out. He could no longer afford to hunt his prey one by one in the shadows. He needed to force a final confrontation, to cut off the serpent's head before the law caught up with him or the cartel found him. The methodical hunt had to give way to a direct and decisive assault. He needed to accelerate the endgame, even if it meant exposing himself to much greater danger. Patience had given way to urgency. El Carnicero, increasingly paranoid and impatient, decided to take matters into his own hands. Fed up with his incompetent men, he devised his own trap. Using one of his least trusted lieutenants as bait, he leaked information about a major drug shipment that would take place at an abandoned train terminal. The news spread through the underworld, designed to reach the ears of the vigilante. El Carnicero and his best men would be waiting in the shadows, ready to annihilate the ghost who dared to challenge him on his own turf. It was a show of power, an invitation to a deadly dance that he was convinced he would win. Pedro heard the rumors. The information was too good, too easy. His instincts, honed by years of survival and the hunt, screamed that it was a trap. The old Pedro would have retreated, but El Espectro saw an opportunity. They wanted him. They would have him, but on his terms. Instead of avoiding the trap, he decided to dive headfirst into it, to use it as a means to his final goal. This was the decisive action that would change the course of his war. He would no longer be the ghost who reacted. He would become the force that instigated the collapse. He would go to the train terminal not to find the bait, but to dismantle the trap and turn the tables on El Carnicero himself. On the appointed night, the abandoned train terminal was plunged into a tense silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the rusty train cars. El Carnicero's men were in position, waiting, but Pedro was already there, moving through the underground service tunnels. Instead of attacking the bait, he began to hunt the hunters on the peripheries of the trap. Using the echo of the vast terminal, he created phantom sounds, luring guards away from their posts and eliminating them in the shadows. What was meant to be a controlled ambush quickly devolved into disorienting chaos for the cartel men, who began shooting at shadows and doubting their own senses. Amidst the confusion he had orchestrated, Pedro focused on his true objective: to capture someone high-ranking. He identified the voice of one of Vargas's key lieutenants, a man known for his cowardice. Ignoring the foot soldiers, Pedro ambushed him, dragging him into the darkness of a freight car. There was no struggle, only the shock and terror on the man's face as he was confronted by the vigilante he was supposed to be hunting. With the blade of his cane pressed against the lieutenant's throat, Pedro didn't want his life, but the final key to his revenge: the exact location of El Carnicero's fortress. The interrogation was brief and brutal. Pedro didn't use physical torture but psychological terror. The total darkness of the freight car, the sounds of gunshots and screams from outside, and the vigilante's cold voice promising a slow and painful death were enough to break the lieutenant. Stammering, he revealed everything. Vargas's headquarters wasn't a mansion or an office, but a place that lived up to his nickname. A decommissioned slaughterhouse on the outskirts of the city. A labyrinth of metal and concrete where the smell of blood never faded. With the information in hand, Pedro left the man tied and gagged, a gift for the police, and disappeared into the night. When Sergeant Morales and his team arrived at the terminal, they found a scene of carnage and confusion. Several cartel members were dead, others had fled, and the bound lieutenant was babbling incoherent stories about a blind demon. Morales found the usual wooden flower, but he also noted the strategy behind the chaos. This wasn't a simple act of revenge, it was a tactical operation. The vigilante had not only survived a trap, he had used it for his own ends. Morales realized with a chill that the hunt was no longer random. The blind avenger was moving in for a checkmate, and the final confrontation was terrifyingly close. Alone on a rooftop with the city spread below him like a sea of lights and shadows, Pedro felt the cold wind on his face. The sound of sirens approaching the train terminal was the soundtrack to his escalation. He had the name, he had the location. All that separated him from his destiny was one last dive into hell. His journey, which began in the darkness of despair, had led him to the precipice of absolute vengeance. He felt no joy or satisfaction, only the weight of his mission. He was no longer Pedro Maria, the artisan, nor just el Espectro, the vigilante. He was a purpose, a force of nature ready to collide with the heart of the rot that had destroyed his world. The slaughterhouse awaited him. The slaughterhouse rose against the night sky like a carcass of metal and concrete, a monument to death. The smell hit Pedro from 100 meters away, a nauseating mix of clotted blood, rust and cleaning chemicals that couldn't erase the ghosts of countless lives ended there. For him, that place was not just his enemy's fortress. It was hell made manifest, a sensory labyrinth where every echo, every draft of air told a story of pain. He infiltrated through a drainage chute, a narrow and filthy tunnel that deposited him in the heart of the beast. Inside, the sound of the wind howling through gaps and the rhythmic dripping of water into puddles formed a macabre symphony, the perfect soundtrack for the final act of his opera of revenge. The path to El Carnicero was a death row gauntlet. Guards patrolled the labyrinthine corridors, their flashlights cutting through the darkness like blades of light. But the darkness was Pedro's kingdom. He moved with a spectral fluidity, his bare feet making no sound on the wet concrete floor. The confrontations were inevitable, explosions of sudden and brutal violence. In a narrow hallway, he used the chains hanging from the ceiling to ensnare a guard before neutralizing him. Against two others, he smashed one of the few light bulbs, using the sudden darkness and their disorientation to attack with savage ferocity. Each encounter was a test of his limits, a deadly dance where his cane was both partner and lethal weapon. Finally, he reached the vast processing floor, a cavernous hall where meat hooks hung from the ceiling like trees in a steel forest. In the center, under a solitary industrial light, stood Ricardo El Carnicero Vargas, surrounded by his elite guards. Before they could react to his presence, Pedro hit the fuse box with a precisely thrown piece of metal, plunging the hall into near-total darkness, broken only by faint emergency lights. Then his voice echoed through the space, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Ricardo," he whispered, the sound amplified by the hall's acoustics. "Do you remember Sofia and Anna? They remember you." The psychological terror had begun, forcing the monster to confront the names of his victims. "Shoot! Shoot everywhere!" El Carnicero screamed, his arrogance crumbling into a furious panic. His men obeyed, filling the hall with the roar of automatic weapons. Bullets ricocheted off the metal surfaces, and the muzzle flashes illuminated chaotic, fleeting scenes. For the guards, it was a disorienting nightmare. For Pedro, it was a map. He used each flash to locate a target, each echo to predict a movement. Moving between the sound and the fury, he was a phantom reaper, a blur in the periphery of their vision. One by one, the guards fell, victims of an enemy who completely dominated the sensory battlefield, using their own violence as his most effective weapon. Soon the sound of gunfire ceased, replaced by the heavy silence and the panting breath of two men. Only Pedro and El Carnicero remained. The cartel boss, a burly man of brute strength, wielded a butcher's cleaver, his silhouette barely defined against a distant emergency light. The fight that followed had none of the elegance of a duel, but the savagery of a cage match. Ricardo's strength against Pedro's speed and precision. The cleaver sliced through the air, while Pedro's cane struck and parried in a furious rhythm. It was a primal battle, fought in a nightmarish setting, the sound of their efforts echoing through the silent slaughterhouse like the clash of two animals fighting to the death. In a moment of desperation, El Carnicero charged, ignoring a blow from Pedro to land a brutal punch that sent him to the floor, making him drop his precious cane. The villain was on top of him, the cleaver raised, a triumphant and sadistic smile on his face. "I'll take you to hell myself, you damn blind man," he snarled. In that instant, with death imminent, Pedro's mind filled not with hate, but with a vivid image, his daughter's smile as he handed her a small wooden flower. That love, pure and eternal, was the source of his final strength. With a burst of energy, he rolled, grabbed a loose metal hook from the floor, and drove it into his opponent's leg. El Carnicero's scream of pain echoed through the hall. Pedro was on his feet, limping, but now in total control. He disarmed the cartel boss and pressed him against a steel table, the tip of his cane's hidden blade at his throat. Revenge was there, a simple movement away. He could feel the man's pounding heart, smell his fear. But as he looked down at the pathetic, trembling figure, Pedro understood that death would be a release, a quick end to suffering. His revenge was not about the end, but about poetic justice. He wanted Ricardo to understand what it was to be helpless, to be left in the darkness. With a cold and calculated decision, he pulled the blade away and, using the steel pommel of the cane, struck his enemy's eyes with precision, extinguishing his light forever and condemning him to the same dark prison he had been given. Leaving behind the screams of a broken man in a self-imposed darkness, Pedro walked away from the slaughterhouse without looking back. The sound of Ricardo Vargas's agony was the only witness to his complete revenge. He emerged from the fetid building just as the first pale rays of dawn began to pierce the night, the timid light touching his face, grimy with blood and soot. The dawn, however, brought no warmth or relief. With the end of his hunt, the fire that had consumed him was extinguished, leaving in its place a cold and infinite emptiness. The purpose that had kept him alive for so long was gone, and the silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. He had won, but his victory tasted of bitter ashes. Months later, Mexico City had absorbed the story into its urban folklore. El Carnicero's cartel, decapitated and fractured, collapsed into infighting, consuming itself. Ricardo Vargas himself became a pathetic figure, a blind and crazed beggar, whose ravings about a vengeful ghost were dismissed as the babbling of just another street lunatic. As for Pedro, he vanished. He did not return to his alleys, was not seen in any shelter. He dissolved back into the shadows from which he had emerged, leaving behind only a legend. El Espectro became a horror story whispered among criminals, a cautionary tale that ensured even the most powerful men would look at the darkness with fear forever. Sergeant Morales was the first to arrive at the slaughterhouse. He found a broken but alive Ricardo Vargas and immediately understood the nature of the justice that had been served there. He saw the path clearly. He could reopen the Pedro Maria case, launch a manhunt for a ghost, and perhaps, with great luck, arrest the man who did what the justice system never could. But as he looked at the ruins of Vargas's empire, Morales made a decision. In his final report, he attributed the carnage to a cartel dispute and declared the Justiciero Ciego officially dead in the confrontation. It was his own quiet act of rebellion, a tacit acknowledgement that in a crooked world, justice sometimes needs to follow equally crooked paths. On a cold morning, weeks after silence had fallen over the city, Elena found a small gift on the doorstep of her chapel. It was a wooden flower, but different from the others mentioned in the papers. This one was perfectly carved, each petal smooth and delicate, the work of a master artisan, not a killer. There was no note, no word. It was a silent message that only she would understand. Holding the small flower, She felt not fear, but a deep melancholy. It was proof that the man she had tried to save, Pedro, the creator of beauty, still existed somewhere inside the monster. She kept it as a relic, praying that his wandering soul might one day find its way back from the darkness. Pedro Maria's journey did not end with peace or redemption. Vengeance gave him a reason to breathe, but with every step he moved further from the memory of the man his family had loved. He became the dark guardian of a city that had forgotten him, a ghost, condemned to wander in his own purgatory, forever blind, forever vigilant. Justice was served, but at what cost? The answer remained lost in the darkness he embraced as his final destiny. Stories like Pedro's force us to question the lines between right and wrong. If you felt the weight of this journey and believe in the power of such accounts, your subscription is essential for us to continue. Thank you for staying with us until the end.